In the United Kingdom today, every hour, some 20 people die of cancer. In the UK today, every hour, some 60 new cancer cases are reported. If you transfer that into a day, it's the equivalent of 3 serious plane crashes a day, every day of the year. And if that were to occur even just in one day, it would be front page news. So when you think of 500,000 people dying in the United Kingdom and 18 million people getting cancer around the world, 10 million of whom die, then we have to concede that cancer is a serious health problem. Now, because of that, enormous money is being spent on cancer research. And you would have thought that 400 million a year in the UK alone, and much more than that in other countries like the United States, that we would have had some success in combating the problem. But the result is that cancer incidence, new cases, are forecast to grow by about 10% by 2038 to 40. So clearly, not only do we not expect to cure cancer, not only are we not curing cancer, but cancer is now responsible for an increasing percentage of human mortality around the world. Now, this talk will look at 4 areas. First of all, I want to take a look at the amount of money being spent on cancer research and where it's going, what kind of research there is. Nextly, I want to look at the kinds of cancer which are there and how prevalent they are, what the percentage of mortality is, what the chances of survival are. Then, I want to look at the ways cancer is being treated. That's part 3 of this talk. I want to look at the way cancer is being treated today and what are the restraints which are making it so unsuccessful. And I want to take a look at other potential curative treatments for cancer and look at the pros and the cons, for which I'm grateful to Quack Watch and Dr. Stephen Barrett for giving me a great deal of information about the cons of cancer research, cons of cancer treatment, and the quacks that have attempted to bamboozle the public into paying for work which doesn't work. And finally, I want to look at the future and see how we can change the problem into a solution. And that is the structure of my talk. Hello, my name's Roger Coghill. I'm a retired biologist and I want to talk about cancer. My laboratory of 30 years independently has been researching this part of medical science, and we've come up with a few peer-reviewed published papers, but a basic discovery that although it's been pointed to by several Nobel Prize winners in the past, has never really reached the mainstream. And for those people who've either suffered cancer or know someone who has, who are treating people with cancer, this might be new information. And because of that, I think it's time I came out with it and tried to explain it in terms which every ordinary person will understand. I do appreciate the need to explain it in a technical sense too, so when I've talked about existing studies and papers published in the peer-reviewed literature, I've used the Harvard system to identify them, and at the end of this video you will find the exact references to the papers I've mentioned. And really, what I'm trying to say is that we've got it wrong about cancer. We don't look at it from the right perspective. We look at it from the point of view of carcinogens, which is not the right way to look at it. What we should be looking at is the actual way in which cancer is caused. And I don't think that mainstream science, medical science, does that. And that's why I'm making this video and putting it up to YouTube in the hope that people will listen to what I have to say. Well, why should they listen to what I have to say? I better tell you something about me before I start my talk. I got a scholarship when I was 11 years old to a school called the City of London School, which is a public school based in London. And that school's boasted some famous people who were in the same year as me. For example, Mike Brearley, captain of England cricket, Lawrence Collins, a senior international lawyer, Mike Apted, a well-known film producer. Some of these people have become very famous. Now, I haven't become very famous, except in a very limited area of biology, which is my main pursuit, and that is the science of bioelectromagnetics. It's a long word, but what it really means is looking at the way in which the physical energies of electricity and magnetism have a part to play and how they influence us in the natural world, not just human beings, but animals, plants, and other life forms. So that is where I'm coming from. After the school, I went to Cambridge University and I got a senior exhibitionership in biology there, as well as being an open scholar in classical studies, and came out with a pretty good degree, upper second in both cases. So then I went on actually to do a master's in environmental management at the University of Wales, as well as an MPhil in Surrey University. So I've done the academic route as far as I can go, but I really didn't want to sit within the academic environment. So around about 1980 odd, I started an independent laboratory of my own, which went for 30 years, and during which time we did some very pioneering and unfettered research into topics like childhood leukemia and so on. So that's my background, and I think that because of those academic and related accolades, I am entitled to a hearing, and that's what I hope that you will give me as I give this talk. Thanks so much. But I want to stress that I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm not qualified to treat people. But I have to say that the Royal Society of Medicine recognised that the work we did in our laboratory had value and invited me to become a member of the RSM, which I felt was very kind. But I didn't want to be called Dr. Coghill, so I didn't go further with that, but I did use their library for many years researching our studies. Anyway, the other thing is, I suppose a lot of people claim on the internet these days that they've done so much and they've been this and that. So just for the record, I've put on to this video copies of the certificates of Cambridge University and the Institute of Biology, where I was a member for many years, and I'm in fact on the technical committee of the Bioelectromagnetic Society, which is arguably the most important scientific society in my particular branch of biology. So I thought I'd better put those in as well, just to give you some confidence in me and what I'm going to say to you. And what I'm going to say to you follows along the lines that have actually achieved some recognition already in on the internet, but they don't go the whole way. They don't give the whole story. So I'm going to be adding to what doctors like Dr. Seefeld says on Diary of a CEO, which I recommend you to watch, and work offered by John Campbell. And those kinds of free speech, which hasn't been shut down by YouTube, form part of what I'm going to say, but they don't go the whole way. And what I am going to say will give you a better insight into cancer than any of those I've so far seen on the internet. Thank you so much, and now let's get on with the talk. Well, this is part one of my four-part talk, and this concerns cancer funding, not only in the UK or US, but all around the world. And I honestly thought that this would be probably the easiest section of my talk to give, because the statistics would be easily available and I wouldn't need to dig into the internet very much to get the figures. But actually what confronted me was a bramble bush forest of links and connections to different parts of Cancer UK's, Cancer Research UK's website, to the NCI website of the National Institutes for Health in the States. And so I found it much more difficult than I thought. But so let me start by at least giving you the basic figures that I found. And the first thing I found was that Cancer Research UK, CRUK, invested £399 million in cancer research in 2023-24. And that was actually out of a total fund of 600 or more million pounds. So about 2/3 of their available money was going actually into cancer research. But that's not the end of the story, because where that money is coming from, over 60% of that money comes from the private individual, from the taxpayer, and from other donors who have given Crook their money. But that is quite a lot. The government, the UK government, apparently invested £121 million in 2022-23. Sorry, yes, 2002-23. And actually that points to a little thing I also noticed, that some of these figures are way out of date. I mean, whereas, one would expect to see the 2023 figures by now, nearly the beginning of, well, it is the beginning of 2025, much of their statistics relates only to periods like 2018, 2016, and that kind of area, at least 5 years before. Now, that's not so much the case with the United States, where the figures, in my opinion, are much easier to get hold of and much more up to date. And another big challenge that faced me when I was trying to get these figures together was the number of institutions involved, and they all got their own acronyms. I ended up writing out a list of some of the acronyms which the cancer industry uses to identify itself. We've got the LRCF, which funded about £64 million a year. The CRC, Cancer Research Council, which funded about £61 million a year. But there are all these other government and non-government institutions, charitable institutions, like AICR, a company called Breakthrough, Leukemia Research, the Ludwig Institute, the Marie Curie Institute, Tenovus, the Yorkshire Cancer Institute. I mean, there are so many of these, but by and large, the total amount of investment in cancer research, let's say in 2023, because it's the nearest I can get, and although some of those figures are earlier than that, is seriously around about, over £400 million. But in the United States, if you took it as a rate of pounds per 100,000 or 200,000 population, the United States pays or funds at least 5 times as much per individual person or per individual person in the population. So the UK is not by any means the hardiest of investors. Mind you, the NCI, in the National Cancer Institute in the United States, which is part of the National Institutes for Health, there are 9 others, or 9 altogether, I think. They don't exactly have a clean bill of health. They've had some how shall I say, difficult moments in the past. For example, they stole the HIV virus from the Pasteur Institute, who took them to court, and the NCI accidentally sent them a couple of documents which proved that they had stolen what the French called the LAV, and they both went into a huddle, and they ended up agreeing to fund HIV research, and that's how it ended. But it didn't exactly pour glory over the NCI and Robert Gallo and Anthony Fauci, who were involved with all that. And Anthony Fauci has also been apparently accused of funding HIV vaccine research, or in the China, and that's how apparently it got out of his laboratory, or his funded laboratory in Wuhan, and caused a world pandemic. So the NCI does have quite a few questions to answer, but they nevertheless give us the latest figures, and that's what I was trying to get hold of. And the US, let's see if I can give you these now. I also will put up tables so you can see them and read them better. But the NCI have a funds program called Between, and that program is what collects the data and distributes it. $7.1 billion, and that was up 5.7% on the previous year. They have some various programs, including Moonshot, started in December 2016, and that authorized $1.8 billion over 7 years to accelerate prevention and screening. And in 2023, that program funded $216 million. And as for funding of various types of cancer, the highest is $2.7 billion on breast cancer, which is 11% of their total, $2.3 billion on hemo funding, and $1.3 billion on brain cancer funding. So that you can see from that the US is spending a far greater amount on cancer research than the UK. Never mind, the UK is still funding quite a lot of stuff. But let's get a hold of the global figures, because that's where we're really interested, because that's where any breakthroughs might be found. Doesn't have to be in any particular one country. It'll soon get translated to everywhere else. So the amount of new cases in the world last year was 19.3, and the number of deaths in 2020 was 10 million. The number of deaths in the latest year was, I believe, 9.7 million, and that's the global picture. But what's happening is that the changes are occurring within age groups. For example, the 25 to 49 year age group is increasing all around the world, and whereas the 50 plus, the 50 to 74 age group is declining slightly, that's rather more due to prevention than any particular form of cancer treatment which has been discovered by the research. So we've got a situation where enormous millions of pounds each year are going into cancer research. The next thing I want to look at really is what kind of research they're doing. because the statistics of mortality and prevalence and incidence are not going down, and that's the point. How can someone spend 400 million in 1 year to try and cure a disease and not have some kind of success? And furthermore, not spend any of that money, or much of it, on other forms of treatment than the three majors. And the three majors, of course, are surgical resection or incision, the chemotherapies, and the radiotherapies. There are some immunotherapies as well, but those aren't really being applied. Maybe they're doing the research, and I'll be showing you some studies which report that. But areas, whole areas like phytochemicals, the impact of phytochemicals on cancer, which has been shown in many studies to be useful, I don't see much research going into that. And other therapies which have got some kind of clinical evidence, if not a lot of clinical evidence, like the Coghill remedies, the use of ivermectin, and the other things like IMM101, which is an immunotherapy, they're not being applied. So there's something really seriously wrong in the system, that so much money, I mean, I could almost re-quote Churchill, I mean, never in the history of science has so much money been applied by so many for so little result. I'm going to have to fight them on the beaches on that one. Yeah. Well, this is part 2 of my cancer talk, and concerning where the money that we talked about in part 1 is actually being spent, on which kinds of cancer and which parts of the world are doing the funding of research. And just as in part 1 I found it a bit of a bramble bush trying to work out from various sources, and there are quite a few different ones, where the incidence and mortality figures were. And in this part I'm trying to find out where that money is being spent, and which parts of the world and what kind of research is being carried on. And it is actually quite a complicated business. But to help us, I think the best start is with IARC's Globoscan figures. And they do give you a global picture of the places where cancer is being where cancer is occurring, and at what rate it's occurring. But to get to the figures of what money is being spent, we have to really start looking at individual areas of the world. So to look at the global picture in terms of areas, I thought the best way would be to take global cancer incidence and mortality to see where that is. And that's normally being divided into 5 different areas by Globoscan, and they are Africa, the Americas, Oceania, Asia and Europe. And if you look at that, Asia has got the largest mortality at 56.1%. And then that's followed by Europe at 20.4%. The Americas only account for 14.9%. Africa 7.8%, and Oceania only about 0.8%. So actually, what you can glean from that is that the less developed countries have lower cancer rates than the more developed countries. And that is suggesting that lifestyle plays a big part in cancer creation. But that's not really what this part's about. This part's more about what is being spent on cancer research. And there's no doubt that not only is America the largest spender of money on cancer research, but their figures make the UK figures pale into comparison. In the UK, something like Cancer Research UK's projects in 2023-24, they spent £19 million on lung cancer. Now you compare that with the US, and in the United States, the figures are much higher. For example, the lung cancer figures. Cancer Society gives us quite good figures and quite up to date on specific areas of research. And in the United States, according to ACS, the most researched area is not lung cancer, which is number 2, but breast cancer. And the figures that they give are, for specific projects, are 78 million for breast cancer research, 37.8 million for lung cancer research, 31.8 for colon cancer, 19.8 million for leukemia, 18.5 for prostate cancer, and brain cancer 16.0, ovarian cancer 15.3, pancreatic cancer 15.0, and liver cancer $14.5 million. So then melanoma 18.1, and so go on. So these figures, if you add them all up, come to about 28 billion, far higher than the UK spend. Well, as for the UK, Cancer Research UK gives their project figures for 2023-24, and they are like this: lung cancer 19 million, colorectal cancer 19 million, breast cancer 18 million, leukemia 16 million, brain cancer 12 million, pancreatic cancer 9 million, prostate cancer 8 million, ovarian cancer 6 million, and esophageal cancer 6 million. So those are the figures for UK, taken by, spent by Cancer Research UK. Now, of course, they're not the only people spending money on cancer, but they are very representative of them. And the total for their spend on cancer research in 23-24 was 164 million. And that included 19.9 million for children, cancer in children less than 24 years old. Well, that's more or less the figures by region and by type. But the question next is, of course, what kind of treatments are they doing, researching? And one has to confess that these are all related to 3 major interventions, as we know: surgery, chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Now, you might ask, well, why is that? Because cancer research has 2 elements to it. It's got what we call discovery research, where we try to find out new things about the causes, and translational research, which is trying to find how you can convert those causes into clinical practice. So there's that element, but the other issue is, and a lot of money is being spent on, how to get earlier, because what people talk about is the survival rate after 5 years after diagnosis, or 10 years after diagnosis. So it stands to reason that the earlier you can diagnose a cancer, the more chance the statistic emerging for 5-year survival will be better, and for 10-year survival too. But what you notice is that, for example, in breast cancer, whereas the survival rate for breast cancer, taking all stages into account, 1 to 4, the average for 5-year survival is 85%, whereas the average for 10-year survival is only 75%. So the earlier you can diagnose the problem, the better chances are that the survival rate will look better in the statistics. And that's why so much work is being done on early diagnosis, and new discoveries are being made about how quickly you can diagnose a cancer type from, let's say, blood or some biomarker which will help you get there. And I think in a way, one can't deny that's a good idea, but it would be far better to look at new forms of therapy and do research on those when the evidence in the literature supports further research. And I don't see that happening so much. But I will talk about that in part 3. Meanwhile, I hope I've just given you a taste of what the money, the enormous amount of money around the world, which is raised for cancer research, or is given to cancer research, how that's being spent and in which directions. Okay. This is part 3 of my talk, and this part is to do with therapies, both those which are used and those which might be used and those which shouldn't be used. So you may remember at the end of part 1 I made a rather abrasive remark that misquoting Churchill, and said that never in the history of science was so much money spent by so many people to achieve such a small result. Well, that was a bit unfair to Cancer Research UK, because I do notice that of the 164 million net that they spent on research, they've got it in the right order. You know, the 19 million on lungs, 19 million on colorectal, 18 million on breast cancer research, 16 million on leukemia, and 12 on brain. So they're more or less following the same pattern as the kind of numbers of people which are getting those disorders. Anyways, the new chief executive was quite proud of herself in the annual report. She featured a cohort study which has been going on for some years on cervical cancer in women, and they reported on a new study which had compared giving chemotherapy before giving X-ray against just giving X-ray and accompanying it at the same time with the chemo. And she was very pleased that the results seem to indicate that this was a good way of treating cervical cancer. But what she didn't mention was that the side effects on both methods were very bad and worse when you give the chemo separately from the radiotherapy. She also didn't mention that the improvement was more or less the same, but a little bit, not a great deal better when you use chemotherapy. And also when I looked at the authors of the study, I couldn't help but comment that so many of them seem to have affiliations with the pharmaceuticals industry, which they declared, quite honestly. But I do believe that they could have been using better treatments than just chemo before radiotherapy. And as an example of that, I would like to talk about the use of melatonin as an adjuvant for cancers. There is a great deal of evidence that melatonin helps people with cancer and reduces the side effects, the symptoms. It's completely safe. In fact, arguably it's safest biomolecule on the planet. And it's very effective, of course, in other ways. It's a very powerful antioxidant. It protects the fetus in the womb. But there are quite a few studies now, I don't know how many exactly, but I think it's in the 20s, which show that when you use melatonin as well as the conventional 3 interventions, you do get a better result. But in vain, I looked through Cancer Research's extensive website, and I couldn't anywhere find any mention of melatonin except for one small sentence which says it helps you get a better night's sleep. But doesn't look as if they've ever done any studies on melatonin in conjunction with existing therapies. And time and time again, the studies which I did read on melatonin showed and concluded that it was really well worth carrying out further research on that particular indole. Anyway, maybe Cancer Research UK was influenced by a report which was produced by the government in 2006 on melatonin and cancer by one of the committees that the government set up. And they were very lukewarm about it. They said, well, it's not really worth following up on. But when I looked down through the references in that report, I discovered that they had omitted every single paper produced by arguably, the world's most important researcher on melatonin, and it happens to be a friend of mine, Russ Reiter, who has written 300 papers or more on melatonin, and is arguably the most respected researcher in that field in the world. And they didn't even mention him in the government report of 2006. So my inclination is that I really don't pay much attention to their weak conclusions about melatonin. It's very important that we conduct research into melatonin and see just how much it can help cancer patients. And I'll talk about them a little bit later. And I would be interested to see if in the future Cancer Research UK does actually start looking at that particular area of cancer cure. And I wouldn't say it cures. I don't think melatonin will cure cancer, but I think as an adjuvant it's a pretty powerful hormone. At this point I'd like to talk a bit about the
1939 Cancer Act in the United Kingdom, because it throws some light on why present therapies are more or less restricted to surgery, chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Now that act was set out in 1939 on the verge of the Second World War, and before there was any television, and certainly before there was any internet, which promotes and disseminates information to the general public. And it was designed because there were a lot of quack treatments being offered around that time, and the original purpose of the bill and the act was to restrict those or prevent those. But in doing so, it gave rise to far more emphasis on the three major interventions which we see today. Most of that act has now been repealed, but Section 4 still remains, and that enables and empowers trading standards units to bring prosecutions wherever they feel it's necessary. And in fact, I was part of one in Isleworth Crown Court, where I was an expert witness on behalf of Mrs. Elizabeth Marsh, who got 6 months for publishing a pamphlet which invited people with AIDS to test out a cancer therapy. I think my evidence was disallowed by the judge on the basis that the jury wouldn't understand it, which was not true, because I'd written it in a very popular style and not at all too technically for them. But anyway, there are some reasons why the 1939 Cancer Act needs total revision or complete renewal in a different sense, now that we have completely different modes of public awareness. And it's not the law which is controlling exposures and quacks, it's the social media. It's the television companies can choose whether or not to discuss an issue. They can stop it or start it. The internet providers, they can delete any videos or information that they choose. So we need to re-look at that area. Anyway, I think there are better therapies than the three major ones. And I'd like to point to melatonin as one of those. Now, I'm not promoting any particular product. I want to make it quite clear that my talk is aimed towards information and to the medical professionals, and not promoting any particular product or service, because I don't want to be branded as having contravened the 1939 Cancer Act. But I would like to talk about melatonin. And I'd said in another part of this talk, I put up 4 studies. I ended up putting over 200 studies on melatonin and cancer, which really are enormous levels of evidence that we should be looking at this in relation to cancer, looking at melatonin in relation to cancer. I know that Thomas Seyfried has been talking a lot about cancer as a metabolic disorder, and he's right. And he also mentions Warburg. I notice he doesn't mention Zent-Gorgi, who had the same opinion. But he doesn't really, although he understands the oxidative phosphorylation change towards glycolysis, and that by limiting sugar intake you are starving the cancer cells. Yes, that's probably true. But he also says it won't cure cancer. It'll just bring down the level of tumours and so on to a point where they're more easily treated by conventional therapies. But he doesn't mention the rest of the story. For example, William Koch not only recognised all that and laid out the biochemistry of it, but he also discovered the aberrant cells, the cancer cells, can be brought back to normal. And I think that philosophy is superior to the present one, that the objective is to kill the cancer cells. He didn't kill the cancer cells, he just got them back to normal OXPHOS pathways. And that is a much better approach to dealing with cancer, in my opinion, than the present one of what some people call cut, poison and burn. I think it's important then that I do explain something about how Koch's how his therapies work, because he's been accused of so many things. The first one he's been accused of is that he was only offering pure water. Well, the court cases against him by the FDA in 1943 and 1946 were only a few years, if that, after the first invention of spectrophotometry. So it's unlikely that anyone at that time looking at a high dilution could detect the fact that even with what homeopathists call 6x dilution, which is taking the chemical, or whatever it is you're diluting, and then putting into a water solution, then taking 1/10 of that and doing it again 6 times till you get to a very high dilution. Even in that high dilution, there are thousands of molecules of that chemical. And that is what Koch aimed to do. He didn't want masses of that chemical, in this case parabenzoquinone, to be around, because it works better if it's got the freedom to do its job. So by that high dilution, William Koch was able to change the glycolysis pathway back to the OXPHOS pathway. And let me explain this. Normally, the creation of energy for us and in our bodies is in the mitochondria, in its inner matrix. And what it does is it separates hydrogen atoms so that the positively charged hydrogen proton is one side of the membrane and the negatively charged electron is on the other side, and that's the procedure with what's called electron transport. And how it does that is it uses a quinone, a CoQ10. We've all heard of CoQ10, you can get it in pharmacies, but the Q stands for quinone. And that actually acts as a free radical. And if there's anything in the way blocking the cytochromes at all, it has the electronegativity to pull them out and put the electron in. Well, that's okay, but the modern carcinogens are too powerful, and CoQ10 can't do that. And what Koch did was to discover that parabenzoquinone is more electronegative and has greater pulling power, if you like. Para means that both of the oxygens are on the same side of the molecule. And that extra electronegativity helps to pull any carcinogens out of their binding sites on the cytochromes. Well, in doing it, it does the same thing that the CoQ10 does. It turns itself briefly into a free radical to do that job. And that's how you get the quinones out. Once, if you can deliver a lot of oxygen at the same time, he says keep a very good oxygen level there in the patient or around the patient. If you can do that, then the pathway comes back, the mitochondria go back to normal, and the first thing they do is to rebuild their glycoproteins. Now, because of glycolysis, you'll find that every cancer cell hasn't got a glycocalyx, hasn't got glycoproteins on the surface, because the cell has resorbed them in order to satisfy the glycolysis. And whereas the OXPHOS pathway can create 35 net ATP molecules from one glucose molecule, glycolysis can only create 12 molecules of ATP from one glucose molecule. So, as Lewis Thomas said, if you think like a cell, your situation is that you're desperate for glucose because you're only making 12 molecules under glycolysis. And that's not enough to keep you going, because you need to find that kind of number of molecules, to ATP molecules, to power what's called the sodium-potassium pump, which keeps the cell viable. So the cell says, look, either I have to get 3 times as much sugar from somewhere to support glycolysis, or I have to nearly die and be unable to do my job. So that's what happens. That's what's happening inside the cell. And so what it does is, first it takes off all the sugar it can find, the nearest sources, which are all around its glycoproteins, actually blinds it. It can't hear anything, it can't see anything anymore. It doesn't need the oxygen because glycolysis doesn't use it, it's anaerobic. And so you see these 3 trends in every cancer cell. First, they're not interested in oxygen uptake. Secondly, they don't avoid contact inhibition, so because they don't know anything about outside world. And thirdly, they don't have any glycoproteins on their membrane surface. And that is why those characteristics are there. Anyway, so what the cells then do, of course, is to go looking for glucose. And that's why they invade other epithelial tissue. It's to find the glucose. Angiogenesis is to build pathways to glucose, so that the glucose can come into the growing tumour. And it'll carry on doing that because it can't do anything else. Instead of trying to kill that, you try to get it back to OXPHOS, then you have a better chance of success, because surgery, whatever you say, always leaves a few cancer cells somewhere in the body, which then start to do the expansion, growth, tumour growth again. You get secondaries. Chemotherapy does the same. It doesn't solve the problem. It certainly harms the patient, but it doesn't really solve the problem. And radiotherapy, by killing perfectly good cells, starts creating free radicals of its own, and that again is not conducive to good health. So the essence of Koch's idea was that he didn't try and kill the cancer cells, he tried to get them to come back to normal. And then what happens is quite interesting, because at the end of that process, and I'll show you the chemistry of it, radiotherapy and chemotherapy, they work to some extent, but they don't work fully, because there are going to be secondaries, there are going to be recurrences, and that's why the 10-year survival rate is always much lower than the 5-year survival rate. It's because of secondaries. So we need to rethink the philosophy of how we treat cancer. Anyway, I think I've said enough about that. I will put some more of the biochemistry in this video. Anyway, going on from there are other therapies as well which could be used and aren't, and like antiparasitic drugs, Fenben, and so on. quite a few of those, and they should be explored. Now, I'd like at this point to thank Stephen Barrett from Quackwatch. Although he to some extent throws the baby out with the bathwater, and he condemns some therapies which might have some currency, Quackwatch is an important and useful source of all the articles which have gone on in the past and present, which enable one to get a much more balanced judgment. And I used Quackwatch quite extensively to learn about events which had taken place in the very early part of the 20th century. And I'm grateful to Stephen Barrett, who's now 92, by the way, for that. So we know that the two trials on Koch both failed, and what happened in there was that he had about 40 people who came in and said his therapy didn't work, but he had over 100 people who came in and said yes, it did work, and they'd been cured. And as for Koch himself, he always followed up his patients' life right to the end of their life. He didn't just stop at 10 years, and he was able to say, in many cases that he chronicles, that his patients had lived for 15 or 20 years and died of something else than cancer. So it's very important that we get to know that. There's another area of research that isn't being done, and that is the importance of the alternative current electric field in impacting on our ability to create energy, ATP. I mentioned that the electrons are on one side of the matrix and the hydrogen protons are on the other. And how ATP is created is that it's like a battery, really. You've got a positive and a negative separated, and when you join them, you get a flow of energy, and that energy binds a third phosphate to ADP, and that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is what gives us the energy to go around and to live. That's where we get our life energy from. But the scientists will agree that at power frequencies, at the frequencies we use in our homes, there's no relationship between the magnetic and the electric field, because they're both in what we call the radiating near field. And that means that any research you do on the magnetic field can say nothing about the electric field. And what electric fields are crowds of electrons. So, and if you put crowds of electrons into mitochondria, it's going to depolarize that battery and stop the creation of ATP. And that's what happens. The American Cancer Society, quite inaccurately, completely inaccurately, say that there's no evidence that the electric field does any harm, the AC electric field. But that's untrue. We published in the peer-reviewed literature a study of childhood leukemia where we showed that if the child is sleeping in an electric field anywhere above 20 volts per meter, that child is at 5-fold risk of leukemia. We did that, and it was published, and the statistics we produced were analysed by the Welsh cancer statistician. And that is good evidence that the electric field has an adverse effect. And the government did a study, and they also found that anywhere near a power line, children are far more likely to get leukemia, far more likely being two times. But they said they didn't know why this was happening, and they couldn't relate it to the magnetic field. When they tried to do an electric field study, I noticed that Sir Richard Doll, who was involved in that, diluted the results so that they used 48-hour exposures, measurements, of course the child isn't in bed 48 hours. It's only in bed in 8-hour periods. And I said to him in the public meeting, well, your study is flawed, but you could change it by just taking the measurements when the child was actually in the bedroom. He couldn't answer that question, to be honest. But that's the situation. The electric field is what we need to watch. And in any home in any developed country, somewhere in that home there is going to be a high electric field, well above 20 volts per meter. I think the clearest, and it can get into the water system. I would like to talk about one example. Eddie O'Gorman, who lost both two members of his family, at least, to cancer, asked me to come and look at his home because he had a feeling that there was something to do with electric fields in it, or electromagnetic fields in it. And when I went to his rather nice home, which had been built by an architect, I noticed that what the architect had done was to put both the water system and the electrical supply in the same cupboard, very close to each other. And the effect of that was that in his water system all round the house, the electric field was in the 90 volts per meter region. And that is why his family got so affected. And when I said, look, if you move the water system and the electricity supply at least a meter away from each other, then you will solve that problem, which I think he did. And that is what I found in many homes during my measurements of cancer patients, and in measurements of infants who had died of cot death. Same thing, that the electric field was damaging the infant's ability to send signals to its cells, and what then happened was that the fibres in the corpus callosum were melting because of the brain's attempts to up its intensity to deal with that exposure, and failed, and the infants died as a result. And a professor in, I think it was Newcastle, did a study of the infant death brains, and he found the same thing. He found that the fibres of the corpus callosum had melted and recoagulated in the third and lateral ventricles, and that is another big finding. And when I put that out on the media, a long time ago it was, when I put it out on the media, the next year cot deaths in the United Kingdom fell by 2/3. They were only a third of the level, because mums didn't know whether we were right or anyone else was right. So they decided that they would take no chances and take the kids away from electric fields which they could see. Well, they could see the appliances, I put it that way. And often I would find the field strength in the cot death case locations was well over 20 volts per meter, and the infants would struggle to get to the other end of the cot from the exposure source. And another phenomenon of cot death is that when the mum would see the baby looking pale and ill, she would take it out of the cot, run to the doctor, and by the time she got to the doctor and it was out of the electric field, it had got back to normal. So there is quite a lot of evidence that the electric field is an issue which needs to be looked at from the point of view of cancer therapies. And if you could persuade the public to make sure they didn't sleep in an electric field, I'm sure it would have a beneficial effect on cancer. Anyway, I've said enough about that. There are lots of other interventions, and some which have been ridiculed but really should be re-examined. I think the whole light trial therapy needs re-examination. There's one of the videos on YouTube talks about a doctor who worked for I think it was, one of the big hospital institutions, and he did some trials on light trial with mice and found it reduced their tumours. But that discovery was overwhelmed and suppressed by others, so that light trial is not supported by the FDA. They don't say it does any harm, but they say it doesn't do any good. Well, that may not be the case. There may be something to look at. Apart from those I've mentioned, there are other interventions which should be examined, but I leave you to, and the people who are doing the work, to look into those and investigate them. And meanwhile, I would like to give my condolences to King Charles, Princess of Wales, to some celebrities like Steve Hoy, all of whom have cancer problems, and also to the, I think it's 160,000 people who will die of cancer this year because we are not following the right path towards cure. It's a basic change in philosophy which is needed. I know that doctors follow the Hippocratic Oath, which has 4 sections, but you know, first do no harm is not in those sections. It comes from a different paper by Hippocrates, and the mistranslation by people, first do no harm, that's also wrong. What Hippocrates actually said in his treatise on epidemics, not in the Hippocratic Oath, was this. He says, as to diseases, make a habit of but 2 things. First, help the patient, or at least do no harm to the patient. And that's what he actually said. Well, in my opinion, surgery does harm to the patient, cutting him open. Radio and chemotherapy do harm to the patient because they destroy the good cells at the same time as they're destroying the bad ones. And to kill the cancer cells is the wrong approach, in my view, that we should be following the idea put forward by Koch, by Warburg, and by Szent-Györgyi and others, I suspect, that it's better to get the cell to go back to being normal in its oxidative phosphorylation pathway than to kill it, because you're never going to kill all of them, and sooner or later they'll come back. That's why, you know, the 5-year and the 10-year survival figures always show a decreasing percentage or a decreasing number, because there are always going to be secondaries. We've got to get rid of that idea. Anyway, that's my opinion about the way cancer research is being conducted today, both in America and in UK and Europe. What happens is that the cells are ending up with one free radical, and that goes on to the next cancer cell and turns that back to OXPHOS. So it's a kind of chain reaction and goes all around the body until you've got no cancer cells anywhere in the body. That is what Koch achieved, and that is what we need to research today. Well, this is part 4 of my video on the cancer issues, and part 4 is concerned with the future, and what I have in mind is to tell you about 12 dreams. The 12 dreams I have of the future of humanity and its suffering from cancer and where we're going. To start with, I want to put a show on this video, an example of where we are at the moment, where cancer research, cancer treatments are rigorously controlled by the pharmaceutical industry, called Big Pharma, by Big Food, by charities who aren't really charities, and scientists who aren't really scientists. But anyway, there we are. That's the example of what's happening today. Now, what I want to happen is that the chief executive of Cancer Research UK, CRUK for short, Michelle Mitchell, her ambition for the future of cancer is to achieve 3 out of 4 people instead of 2 out of 4 today, earns £100,000 a year more than our Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. One might have expected her to have more important ambitions than to, as she puts it, stand on the brink of new discoveries. Well, I suppose if you're standing on the brink of new discoveries and you're earning 270 something £1,000 a year basic salary, you might not want to cure cancer that quickly because it's making you so much personal money. And when you look at the large numbers of the team around her, also I doubt not are being very well paid, I can see that there is an argument, there's a vested interest in not curing cancer, because if you cure cancer, then your charity has to fold up and you lose your income. Well, I don't know whether that's true or not, but certainly some people are saying that. But my dreams, I have 12 dreams for the future of cancer. And the first one is a full understanding of aberration. I don't think that, even though we have people like Dr. Thomas C. Fried and others, John Campbell and others, I'm not seeing a completely full explanation of how cancer is caused. I think, yes, I agree it's a metabolic disease, and thereby I agree with 2 Nobel Prize winners, Otto Warburg and Albert Szent-Györgyi, both of whom said it was a metabolic disease and could be cured by that approach. But I think neither of those people mentioned someone who is today classified by Wikipedia as a fraud, but actually predated them and gave out much better biochemistry. And that was William Koch, who was a doctor in Detroit, in Michigan. Now, he's regarded as a fraud. If you read Wikipedia, you get that impression. But when you read the actual work which he did, which thankfully has been posted on the YouTube and elsewhere by his own family, you can see that he was far from being a fraud. He cured thousands of people of cancer in Michigan and in Detroit. And in fact, he points out that between 1920 and 1929, when he was practicing there, the cancer mortalities in America's largest cities were all rising, some as high as 30% in that decade. But in Detroit, where the principal therapy was his, cancer mortality fell by over 20%. Now that's a pretty solid piece of proof that his A, wasn't a fraud, and B, that his therapy worked. And so I think that's my first dream, that causality is completely understood and accepted by the medical fraternity. My second dream is that because of that, we will have full prevention of cancer. And that's because, in any case, they say that 40% of cancers could be prevented by lifestyle changes. So let's get those lifestyle changes and save the NHS billions of pounds. It's my second dream. I think that there ought to be a better awareness of melatonin amongst the elderly. Now, I would say that over 75% of cancers are amongst the elderly, people over 65. And that is, I believe, completely due to the fact that as you get older, your melatonin synthesis decreases, whether it's in the brain, in the retina, or in the gut. It decreases so that by the age of 70, you've only got 10% of the melatonin being synthesized that you had when you were in your prime at 40. Now, so if the elderly population all knew that and all started using melatonin, it's cheap, it's the safest biomolecule on Earth, and it's very powerful as an antioxidant, and it's very anti-aging, and there's plenty of literature to show that. So that's my public donations from people, ordinary people, don't get funneled into cancer research, which is where they dream, altruistically put it at the moment, but get put back into the economy so that our economy strengthens and the cancer, I don't know, mafia, if you like to call it that, doesn't get the funding that they need to do their work. They'll still get funding from the government, therefore that's indirectly from the government, from the public. So they'll have some work to do, because they have a lot of work to do at the moment. But the bulk of that money that they're getting at the moment is coming from the public purse, and it doesn't need to. So that's my next dream. And after that, when public donations are being properly used in the economy of the country and not to support questionable cancer research, I would like to see the influence of big food and big pharma stopped by legal means and by legislation, so that they don't control the research output of institutions like Cancer Research UK. They don't control the government's attitude towards cancer research and their support that they're getting to their various parties from big pharma and other such institutions, and thereby preventing themselves from attacking those institutions because they're getting paid by them. I'd like to see that practice made illegal. Next big dream is that tax avoidance schemes by cancer charities and others are outlawed, so they can't do that. They can't be registered in strange countries where they don't pay any tax. And after that, then my next dream, number 7 I think, is that the peer review system is completely overhauled. At the moment, the peer review system is rubbish. It's crumbling. The oldest system, whereby you submitted a paper, the journal editor would send it to other experts in the field for comment, and if they all said yes, it's okay, then the paper would get published. But there have been some nasty examples of where editors haven't been doing their job properly. I think we have a chance because today's world includes massive amounts of information on the internet, and that's what's happening. You're getting papers being put on the internet so the whole world can be the reviewers, and that's a practice which is exposing a lot of new work which wouldn't, I think, get into journals any other way, and that is informing the public and the professionals much better than the old system, because there was a great queue to get your paper. I mean, my particular journal would have been bioelectromagnetics, and there was a 2-year wait for that to get a paper into that journal, and that's only a minor journal. As for the Lancet, they say they have to reject 80% of the papers they get. So that waiting list is disappearing because of the internet and the ability of researchers to put their papers up for review and comment without having to wait a long time or go to a particular journal. The late Robert Maxwell saw this gap in knowledge, and he started a whole load of scientific journals, knowing full well that scientists would be happy to pay a few £100 to get their papers in them. Well, that practice is now vulnerable to disappearing, and I hope it does. So that's my next dream. And following that, knowledge by the public is also getting much better now than it used to be because of the internet. I mean, in the old days, you'd have to go to your doctor to find out what to do about something that was wrong with you. Today, if you get a cold or cancer or any disease, you can go on the internet and you can find out a lot more about it. The internet, places like YouTube, Google, are providing information to the public at a level never ever experienced before, and that's one of the good things. But of course, at the same time, you're also getting a lot of disinformation. So you have to be a bit careful about that dream, but by and large, taking them all and doing enough of the research, the average member of the public can now become very knowledgeable about any problems health-wise that they have. My next dream is to get rid of the vested interests, not by the pharmaceutical and food industries, but there are others, people who are submitting offers to cure you with a particular product which is rubbish. The result of all those dreams will force the public or persuade the public to change their lifestyle, because problems like obesity, smoking, and taking the wrong foods, not taking on a keto diet, eating too much sugar, all those things are contributing to cancer, and of course in turn causing enormous cost to the National Health Service. And if the public could be persuaded to change their lifestyle, and look at me, I'm 84, I don't have a sign of cancer, I don't have any other problems, I'm healthy, I do my exercise, I don't drink, I don't smoke, and I hope I don't have any kind of dementia. Some people might question that, but by and large, it's possible to live to my age completely healthy. Whereas at the moment, people might live longer, as is often said, but their health state in their later years isn't good. So you get very large fat people, or people who can hardly walk, or hardly do any exercise. They should, if they could change their lifestyle, could be much healthier, much fitter, and I suspect much happier. So that's another of my dreams. And I think also there are other modalities which we haven't yet got around to. I like the communication systems. Now we're all getting used to mobile phones, and we now know that you can send messages through the air wirelessly, which was not the case 40 years ago when I was talking to Ernie Harrison. Ernie's a great character. I had an interview with him when I was working in the city, and he told me, "Hey, Roger," he said, "you must always supply the losing side in any war." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because they're the ones that have to rearm themselves, and therefore you get the business." And he said, and in terms of price, he says, "Start with the highest price you can." He said, because it can always come down. But once you've set a price, you can't really go up. So he gave me a lot of advice, did Ernie? Lovely man, sadly gone now, but the creator, effectively, of what we have today, mobile phones and all the benefits that they can bring, as well as some of the disadvantages, I accept, but by and large, a useful addition to our civilization. Anyway, there are one or two other things I'd like to see as a dream. I think institutions like the MHRA and the FDA has made some rulings which is suppressing perfectly good medicines, including Dr. Koch's remedies, and one of my dreams is to see his remedies being applied and understood. Well, there you are. Those are some of the dreams I have for the future, and my own last dream is I get the Nobel Prize in 2040 for services to science, because I don't mind. I don't want the money, I don't want the glory, but it means that I will still be alive in 2040, because Nobel Prizes are only awarded to the living. Well, thank you very much for your attention in listening to this video all the way through. I appreciate it's quite a long video, but there are longer ones out there if you want to look at some, well over 2 hours, and I think mine's under that. But thanks again, and I hope we can achieve some of my dreams, and I hope that you might have learned something from my video. Thank you.